The morning the HOA fine arrived, the sun was barely over the ridge, turning the fields of corn and wildflowers golden. Grandpa was sitting on his porch, boots propped on the railing, coffee steaming in his hand, when a pack of self-important HOA board members marched up the dirt drive like they owned the place. At their head was Linda, short haircut, clipboard clutched tight, and a glare sharp enough to cut wire fence. She waved the paper in Grandpa's face and declared, loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear, "You are hereby fined $25,000 for unauthorized farming operations within HOA limits." The birds stopped chirping, and even the dogs went quiet. Grandpa leaned forward, squinting at the paper, then leaned back in his chair with the slow smile of a man who'd just been told the funniest joke in town. His silence rattled them more than a shotgun blast. Because what they didn't know, what not a soul in that HOA had ever bothered to check, was that Grandpa didn't just live here. He owned every last square inch of dirt their houses sat on, their precious pool, their tennis courts, even the very spot Linda was standing on to read him the fine. And one day soon they were going to regret ever walking up that porch. He didn't argue, didn't shout, didn't even twitch a whisker of anger. He just sipped his coffee while Linda's voice grew shriller, describing the illegal rows of corn and unsightly pumpkin patch that lowered community values. Behind her, neighbors peered out from manicured lawns, some chuckling, others shaking their heads. Folks had gotten used to seeing Grandpa plow with his old tractor, wearing the same battered hat he'd worn since '72. Most thought he was harmless. Now they whispered like crows, wondering if he'd finally stepped too far. Grandpa set the cup down and asked in a voice calm as summer rain, "Linda, you say these fields break the rules?" She lifted her chin proudly. "Yes. The HOA covenants clearly forbid agricultural use." He chuckled, low and steady, the sound of a storm warming up far off. "Well then," he said, "we'll see about that." The board turned on their heels, smug with victory, already imagining their fine money funding a new clubhouse chandelier. Neighbors shook their heads, muttering things like, "Poor old man's gonna lose the farm, and he should have just planted roses instead." But as their voices carried, Grandpa stayed planted in his chair, smiling like a cat with feathers in its teeth. When the crowd finally drifted off, he pushed himself up, joints cracking, and ambled back inside. There, in the corner of the living room, stood an iron lockbox so old it looked like it might have come west in a wagon. Dust covered the lid, but the key still fit smooth as butter. Inside were yellow deeds, tax receipts, survey maps older than most of the houses in this county. He pulled out the top paper, flattened it on the table, and there it was. His name, signed decades ago, giving him sole ownership of the entire tract. His grandson wandered in, still rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Grandpa, what's all the noise outside?" Sounded like Linda was fixing to bite your head off. Grandpa tapped the deed with a crooked finger. "Boy, those folks think they're fining me. But this land, every field, every brick, every swimming pool, it's mine." The boy blinked. "Even their office?" Grandpa grinned. "Especially their office." For the first time, the grandson understood why Grandpa never worried about petty arguments or HOA letters. He'd been sitting on a secret ace, waiting for the right fools to deal themselves into his game. Outside, the air smelled like cut hay, sweet and sharp. Grandpa folded the papers neatly, slid them into a leather satchel, and set it by the door. He wasn't planning to march into their office shouting. No, that wasn't his style. He'd let the law do the heavy lifting. But first, he wanted to watch them dig their own hole deeper. He walked back to the porch, whistling for his hound, and sat to watch the sun climb higher. Sure enough, Linda was already striding house to house, showing neighbors the fine and gossiping about how Grandpa would finally learn his lesson. The man chuckled, tipping his hat down low to hide the sparkle in his eyes. By noon, word had spread across the entire subdivision. At the diner, folks whispered about whether Grandpa would pay or fight. Some bet he'd end up bankrupt. Others said he'd probably just keep planting pumpkins out of spite. The truth was, Grandpa wasn't worried about pumpkins or fines. He was thinking about how sweet it would feel to pull the rug out from under the people who'd been trying to shame him for years. Because if there was one thing Grandpa couldn't stand, it was being told what he could do on land that was his before the HOA even existed. That evening, as crickets chirped and the last light faded, Grandpa lit a lantern and spread the deeds across the kitchen table. He traced the boundaries with his finger: the creek, the ridge line, the old oak tree by the cul-de-sac. Every inch checked out. He thought of Linda, smug in her HOA throne, and laughed quietly to himself. "Tomorrow, old girl," he muttered. "Tomorrow you find out what ground you're standing on." He picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. When the voice answered, deep and gravelly, Grandpa smiled. "Tommy? It's me. Still practicing law or just fishing these days?" "Good. I've got a case you'll enjoy. HOA thinks they can fine me for farming my own land." A pause, then a hearty laugh from the other end. "Bring the papers," his old lawyer buddy said. "Sounds like we're about to have some fun." Grandpa hung up, leaned back, and for the first time in years felt the buzz of excitement in his chest. He wasn't just going to beat them. He was going to expose them, humiliate them, and remind every last person in this town who really owned the ground they walked on. Outside, the night settled heavy, cicadas droning. Grandpa folded the deeds, tucked them under his arm, and headed for bed. Tomorrow would be the start of something bigger than corn and pumpkins. Tomorrow was the day the HOA learned they were trespassers on the land of the man they'd just tried to fine. And as the old lockbox clicked shut, the house creaked with the weight of history, holding secrets that could topple an entire neighborhood empire. Grandpa smiled in the dark, whispering to himself before sleep took him, "They've got no idea what's coming." The sun hadn't even burned off the morning fog when Grandpa rolled out of bed, tugged on his overalls, and brewed coffee strong enough to peel paint. The satchel with the deeds sat waiting by the door, heavy with the weight of old paper and older promises. His grandson, still bleary-eyed and munching on a piece of toast, asked, "Grandpa, you sure about this? Those HOA folks looked pretty mean yesterday." Grandpa smiled over his cup. "Son, you don't win a war by yelling. You win it by showing up with the right ammunition. And I've got the kind of ammunition no board member alive can argue with." He laid the papers out on the kitchen table again, this time slower, savoring every line. The ink was faded, the signatures written in neat cursive by hands long since gone, but they were as binding today as the day they were signed. The first deed went back to 1958, when the bank collapsed and half the county's land was auctioned for pennies. Grandpa's father had bought the tract outright, a decision folks laughed at the time. "Too much land for one family," they'd said. "Who needs a cornfield that big when you can just move to town?" But his father knew better. He held on to it, passed it down, and when he died, it became Grandpa's legacy. Now, that legacy was about to flip the HOA upside down. The boy traced the map with a finger, marveling. "Wait, this line here. That's the pool, isn't it?" Grandpa nodded. "Yep. And this corner here? That's where Linda built her rose garden." The kid laughed so hard he nearly spilled his juice. "So technically, every time she waters those roses, she's trespassing on your land?" Grandpa leaned back, grinning ear to ear. "Technically? Boy, legally. If I wanted, I could fine her every time she set foot outside." The idea tickled them both, but Grandpa's eyes had that glint of mischief. He wasn't after petty revenge. He wanted something cleaner, something that would sting worse than any fine. By mid-morning, Grandpa drove his old Ford truck into town, deeds stacked on the passenger seat. The tires crunched gravel as he pulled up to a weathered law office with Thomas J. Keegan, attorney-at-law, fading on the sign. Tommy was more than a lawyer. He'd been Grandpa's hunting partner, poker rival, and beer-drinking buddy for decades. Inside, the office smelled like leather and dust. Tommy himself looked like he'd been carved out of oak, grizzled, sharp-eyed, and wearing suspenders that had seen better days. He peered over his glasses as Grandpa walked in. "Well, if it ain't Sheriff Retired. Heard you had a run-in with the neighborhood militia." Grandpa dropped the satchel on his desk. "They fined me for farming my own corn. Thought you'd like a laugh." Tommy opened the satchel, leafed through the deeds, and started chuckling. Then the chuckle turned into a belly laugh that shook the window blinds. "Oh Lord," he wheezed, "they've really stepped in it this time. They've been bossing folks around on land they don't even own." Grandpa pulled a chair up, crossing his arms. "Question is, what's the best way to show them the mess they're in without lifting a finger myself?" Tommy leaned back, tapping the stack of papers with one finger. "Easy. We draft a cease and desist. Serve it right to their office. If they fight, we take it to court. With these deeds, it's checkmate before the game even starts." Back at the subdivision, Linda was parading around with her clipboard again, talking about how Grandpa would be made an example of. She didn't know word had already spread, at the hardware store, at the barber shop, at the gas station, that Grandpa had land papers older than the HOA itself. Folks whispered, "If he really owns it all, then what about my yard?" Fear and curiosity spread like wildfire. Some neighbors began to switch sides, grinning as they imagined the board knocked off their high horse. Others worried they'd lose their precious HOA protection. It was a simmering pot, and all Grandpa had to do was turn up the heat. That night, Grandpa and his grandson sat on the porch again. The cicadas hummed, fireflies flickered in the tall grass, and the air felt heavy with the promise of a storm. The boy asked, "Grandpa, why didn't you ever tell anyone you owned it all?" Grandpa thought for a moment, staring into the dark. "Because it wasn't anybody's business. A man shouldn't have to wave his papers around just to get respect. But when folks start swinging their power like a stick, sometimes you gotta remind 'em who carved the stick in the first place." The boy nodded, half understanding, half still dazzled by the idea that his grandpa owned the entire neighborhood. Then the headlights of a car crept down the road. It slowed in front of the porch, and a shadowy figure rolled down the window. It was one of the quieter board members, a man named Harris, who rarely spoke at meetings. He leaned out and whispered, "Sheriff, you need to be careful. Linda's planning to call in the sheriff's department tomorrow morning to enforce that fine." Grandpa tilted his head, amused. "That so? Well, ain't that something?" Harris nodded nervously. "She doesn't know yet, but those deputies? They still talk about you like you're their captain." Grandpa watched the car pull away, then looked at his grandson. The boy's eyes were wide with worry. But Grandpa just chuckled, slow and steady. "Looks like Linda's about to find out what happens when you pick a fight with a man who's already written the rules." He rose from his chair, dusted off his hat, and headed inside. The lockbox still sat on the table, gleaming faintly in the lamplight. He placed the deeds back inside, but left the satchel by the door, ready for tomorrow. Because tomorrow, the sheriff's department wouldn't be coming for him. They'd be coming for the HOA. The morning started with the clang of a gavel at the HOA's so-called emergency meeting. Linda had summoned the board before the coffee was even poured, and she stood at the head of the long folding table in the community clubhouse like a general preparing for war. Her hair was sprayed stiff, her lipstick sharp, and her voice sliced through the air as she declared, "We cannot let one stubborn old man tear down everything we've built here. If he refuses to pay the fine, we double it. If he still refuses, we threaten liens, foreclosure, whatever it takes." The other board members nodded nervously, scribbling notes, though a few of them shifted uncomfortably, their eyes betraying doubt. It was one thing to bully a neighbor about mailbox paint colors. It was another to tangle with a man like Grandpa. Out on his porch, Grandpa sat with his grandson, the morning sun rising over fields that glistened with dew. He chewed slowly on a piece of bacon, listening to the distant hum of voices from the clubhouse. He didn't have to strain to imagine what was being said. He'd seen people like Linda his whole life, folks who got a little taste of power and mistook it for the whole bottle. His grandson was pacing, worried. "Grandpa, what if they come after us harder? What if they try to take the house? Grandpa chuckled, setting down his plate. Son, you can't take what's already mine. They don't even know they're squatting on my dirt. Let 'em dig their own hole. I've got the rope ready to lower 'em in. By mid-morning, flyers started appearing in mailboxes, thick sheets of paper accusing Grandpa of being a nuisance farmer, claiming his pumpkins and cornfields lowered community standards. Neighbors whispered on sidewalks, some embarrassed, others angry. Kids giggled, running around with the flyers as if they were comic books. Grandpa just watched it all unfold with a smirk. They're spending all their ink on me, he muttered, when they ought to be worrying about their own leaky pool. But Linda wasn't done. That afternoon, she marched up Grandpa's driveway again, this time with 2 other board members flanking her like bodyguards. We're giving you 72 hours, she snapped, jabbing a finger in his direction. 72 hours to clear your crops, pay your fines, and comply, or we'll bring in enforcement. Do you understand? Grandpa rose from his chair, towering over her despite his age, and leaned on his cane. Ma'am, he said softly, you're standing on my land right now. I'd be careful how you talk to the man who lets you walk on it. The board members behind her shuffled their feet. One cleared his throat as if about to speak, but Linda shot him a look sharp enough to silence him. She thrust a fresh notice into Grandpa's hand and spun on her heel, storming back down the driveway. The paper crinkled as Grandpa folded it neatly and set it on the porch table, right beside his coffee cup. His grandson whispered, "Aren't you gonna do something?" Grandpa's eyes twinkled. "Oh, I'm doing something. Sometimes the best move is letting the other side think they're winning. Then you show 'em the scoreboard." Word of the confrontation spread fast. By evening, half the neighborhood was abuzz. Some residents were rooting for Grandpa now, sick of being told what curtains they could hang or how tall their grass could grow. Others clung to Linda's promises of order and value, convinced Grandpa was a menace who dragged them all into chaos. The subdivision was splitting down the middle, a quiet civil war brewing under manicured lawns. Inside his house, Grandpa made a phone call. The next morning, while Linda prepared her paperwork for enforcement, the rumble of engines rolled down the street. Sheriff's Department cruisers, 3 of them, pulled into the neighborhood. Neighbors peered from curtains, expecting Grandpa to be hauled away in cuffs. Linda herself nearly broke into a grin as she rushed out to greet them. "Officers," she said, her voice dripping with satisfaction, "thank you for coming. We need you to enforce a violation." But the deputies didn't even glance her way. They walked right past, straight up Grandpa's driveway, and tipped their hats at him. One of them, a tall man with a gray mustache, grinned. "Morning, Sheriff. Heard you got some troublemakers." The neighbors gasped, whispers rippling through the crowd like a wave. "Sheriff?" They hadn't known. Linda froze, the color draining from her face as realization dawned. Grandpa wasn't just some stubborn old farmer. He was the retired county sheriff, the same one who'd trained half the deputies standing in front of him. Grandpa shook their hands warmly. "Appreciate you boys coming by. Seems some folks are confused about property lines." The deputies pulled a stack of envelopes from their cruiser, cease and desist papers drafted by Tommy, stamped and signed. One by one, they handed them to the HOA board members, their badges gleaming in the sunlight. Linda clutched hers, trembling with rage, while neighbors began to murmur louder. The balance of power had shifted in a single heartbeat. As the deputies drove off, Linda turned back toward Grandpa, her jaw tight, her eyes blazing. "This isn't over," she hissed. "You think you're clever, but you'll lose everything. I promise you that." Grandpa didn't flinch. He just tipped his hat, voice calm as ever. "Careful, ma'am. Promises are heavier than you realize. They got a way of burying the one who makes 'em." That night, under the glow of a lantern, Grandpa and his grandson celebrated with bowls of stew and slices of cornbread. The boy was practically bouncing out of his seat. "Grandpa, you should have seen Linda's face when they called you sheriff. She looked like she'd swallowed a bug." Grandpa chuckled, stirring his stew. Let her stew a while. She ain't done yet. Folks like that never stop digging, even when the dirt's about to fall on their heads. And as the crickets sang outside, the boy asked softly, "What happens next?" Grandpa leaned back, eyes twinkling like embers. "Next, we let 'em swing harder. The more rope they grab, the easier it'll be to tie the knot." By dawn the clubhouse buzzed like a hornet's nest. Linda had gathered her loyalists, clipboard warriors with pressed shirts and too tight smiles, to figure out what to do about yesterday's humiliation. She hadn't expected deputies to show up, much less deputies who saluted Grandpa like he was still their commanding officer. The whole scene had shaken her to her core, but she'd never admit it. Instead, she slapped papers on the table and hissed, "This is a smear tactic. He's bluffing. We'll push harder. We can't let one stubborn old man topple this board." The others nodded, some eagerly, others nervously. Whispers of dissent were growing, but fear of Linda's glare kept most mouths shut. Across the street, Grandpa was up before the sun, sitting on the porch with his hound at his feet. The cicadas hadn't even quieted when the first cars started pulling into driveways, neighbors craning their necks to stare. Word had spread fast. The sheriff's deputies hadn't come to arrest Grandpa, they'd come to hand papers to the HOA itself. The subdivision was buzzing with gossip. Some folks grinned into their coffee mugs, delighted to see Linda humbled. Others whispered worriedly about their property values. Grandpa just sat, sipping black coffee, humming an old country tune. He knew the real fun hadn't even started. Around 9, the cruisers came back. This time there were 4 of them, lights flashing as they rolled into the cul-de-sac. Curtains twitched, garage doors cracked open, children pressed their noses to windows. Linda burst out of the clubhouse, ready to pounce, but the deputies ignored her once again. They walked straight up to Grandpa's porch, envelopes in hand. "Morning, Sheriff," one said, a grin tugging at his lips. "Got the rest of those papers signed. Thought you'd like to do the honors." Grandpa rose slowly, cane tapping against the wooden boards as he stepped down. The deputies fanned out, handing thick envelopes to every member of the HOA board. Linda snatched hers, tore it open, and read the words aloud without meaning to: "Cease and desist order. Immediate suspension of HOA activity on land owned by Mr. James Callahan." Her face went pale, the letters swimming in her vision. Gasps erupted from the crowd of neighbors. They didn't need to know all the legal jargon, what they understood was simple. The HOA had no authority left on Grandpa's land. "Wait a minute," one board member stammered. This can't be right. We've been running this community for years. We've fined people, we've built playgrounds, Grandpa interrupted with a smile as sharp as a knife. "You've been trespassing for years. Running a game on land you never owned. That stops today." His voice carried across the street, landing in every ear, every heart. Neighbors shifted, murmuring, some hiding grins, others wide-eyed with shock. Linda tried to recover, clenching her fists so tight her knuckles whitened. "This doesn't mean anything. He can't just ban us." Grandpa stepped closer, his shadow stretching across her shoes. "Ma'am, it means exactly that. You're done telling folks what color they can paint their mailbox or how long their grass can grow. You're done fining kids for lemonade stands. And you're done standing on my porch, thinking you've got the right to boss me around." The deputies, stone-faced but clearly enjoying themselves, began posting copies of the order on bulletin boards, lampposts, and even the clubhouse doors. One deputy pinned the notice right to the community pool gate. Neighbors flocked to read them, and the whispers grew louder. Some clapped. Others laughed outright. Linda's authority was dissolving before her eyes, melting like ice under a hot sun. By afternoon, the subdivision was split wide open. Half the neighborhood was celebrating, baking pies, grilling hot dogs, even bringing chairs out to Grandpa's porch to thank him. The other half huddled with Linda, fuming and plotting. Lines were being drawn, and everyone knew it. Grandpa, sitting with his grandson, just smiled at the chaos. "You see, boy," he said, patting the kid's shoulder. "Sometimes all you gotta do is shine a light, and the rats start running." But even as the laughter carried on the breeze, Linda wasn't finished. She stormed into the clubhouse with her board, slamming the cease and desist papers on the table. "This is a trick," she barked. "He's bluffing with some dusty old deeds. We'll take him to court. We'll crush him there." Her voice cracked, but her fury masked it well. She leaned forward, eyes blazing. "I don't care if he's the Pope himself. I'll drag him through the mud until he begs us to stop." That night, while neighbors toasted marshmallows in Grandpa's yard, Linda sat in her kitchen, staring at her copy of the order. Her hands trembled as she scrawled notes in the margins, already drafting her plan. She was going to fight tooth and nail, even if it meant tearing the whole neighborhood apart. Grandpa, rocking on his porch under the glow of the lantern, could almost feel her plodding across the street. He smiled faintly, murmuring to himself, "Let her try. Courtrooms are just another kind of battlefield, and I've walked into plenty of those." The hound stirred at his feet, ears twitching at the sound of distant voices. The boy leaned against him, eyes heavy with sleep. "Grandpa, what happens if they take us to court?" Grandpa tilted his hat down, his voice steady as stone. "Then, boy, we'll make history." And as the stars spread like diamonds over the quiet fields, a new tension gripped the air. The papers were posted, the power shift had begun, but Linda's vow still lingered like a storm on the horizon. The war wasn't over, it was only moving to its next battlefield. The morning after the courtroom victory, the neighborhood woke to an eerie quiet. For years the HOA's voice had been everywhere, flyers stuffed in mailboxes, emails threatening fines, Linda's shrill commands echoing across manicured lawns. But now, silence reigned. On Grandpa's porch, the American flag snapped in the breeze as he sipped his coffee, his grandson perched beside him like a squire waiting for orders. The satchel of deeds sat at Grandpa's boots, no longer a secret weapon but a banner of triumph. "You think it's over?" the boy asked. Grandpa chuckled, the sound rough as gravel. "No, son. It's just beginning. Yesterday we showed 'em what the law says. Today we show 'em what it means." By mid-morning, sheriff's cruisers once again rolled into the subdivision, but this time they weren't here with envelopes. They were here with orders. Deputies walked up to the clubhouse doors, posted eviction notices in bold letters, and stood guard while HOA members shuffled out, pale and furious. Linda tried to push past them, screaming about appeals and lawsuits, but the deputies barred her way. "Ma'am," one said flatly, "you're trespassing on private property." The words hit her like a slap. Neighbors lined the sidewalks, whispering, snickering, and in some cases clapping openly. The mighty HOA had been stripped bare, their fortress now just another building standing on Grandpa's dirt. Grandpa didn't strut or shout. He simply walked down the driveway with his cane, tipped his hat at the deputies, and stopped in front of the clubhouse. He stared at it for a long moment, then at the crowd. "This building," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "was raised on stolen ground. From this day forward, it's mine again. And I'll decide what's done with it." A cheer went up from the crowd. Some laughed in disbelief, others whooped with joy. A few loyal to Linda slunk back into their homes, faces burning. That afternoon, Grandpa held what the boy called a reverse HOA meeting right there in his field. Folks dragged over lawn chairs, folding tables, even a grill. Instead of rules and fines, Grandpa talked about freedom, about how people should be able to grow gardens, host barbecues, hang laundry, and let their kids chalk the sidewalks without fear. His words carried weight, but also warmth. He wasn't some tyrant replacing another. He was the man who'd just torn the crown off the HOA's head and tossed it in the dirt. Neighbors clapped, laughed, and some even cried. For the first time in years, the air felt lighter. But not everyone was smiling. Across the street, Linda stood stiff as a post, her arms crossed, eyes red with fury. Every cheer felt like a knife. Every laugh felt like salt in the wound. Her kingdom was collapsing, and it was collapsing around him. She whispered under her breath, promises of revenge, of taking him down even if it meant burning everything to the ground. The days that followed were like a festival. Grandpa invited families to his field, throwing a barbecue that stretched long into the night. He roasted ribs, flipped burgers, and handed out lemonade. Kids ran wild, neighbors swapped stories, and laughter rolled across the fields. At one point, Grandpa stood under the string lights, his hound at his side, raising a glass. "To freedom," he said. "And to neighbors who look out for each other instead of bossing each other." The cheer that followed shook the night sky. But even in the middle of the celebration, the war wasn't truly over. The boy noticed Linda lurking at the edges of the crowd, watching with eyes like coals. She wasn't beaten. Not yet. And late that night, when most had gone home, Grandpa sat on his porch again, pipe glowing, his grandson beside him. The boy asked, "Grandpa, what if she comes back stronger? What if she finds another way to fight?" Grandpa blew a smoke ring into the dark, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Then we'll be ready. A bully's last weapon is always desperation. And desperate folks make mistakes." The next morning, the neighborhood woke to a sight that froze them in place. Linda had spray-painted the clubhouse doors with a single word: appeal. Below it, she'd scrawled, "This fight isn't over." The deputies cleaned it up within the hour, but the message was clear. She was preparing something bigger. Something uglier. Grandpa read the word, shook his head, and laughed quietly. "She still doesn't get it, boy. This ain't about rules anymore. It's about pride. And pride," he said, tapping his cane against the pavement, "is a weak wall to hide behind." The boy leaned close, his voice dropping. "So what's next?" Grandpa's eyes glinted, a grin tugging at his lips. "Next, we bring down the hammer." And as the sun climbed over the ridge, the entire neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. The HOA was evicted, stripped of its power, but Linda was still out there, clawing for revenge. The courthouse smelled of old wood and dust, the kind of smell that carried echoes of every battle ever fought within its walls. Grandpa walked in wearing his cleanest shirt, his boots polished enough to catch the light. His grandson trailed behind, eyes wide, clutching the satchel of deeds like it was treasure. Tommy, Grandpa's lawyer and lifelong friend, strode beside them, his suspenders stretched over his barrel chest, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Relax, Jim," he whispered. "This is going to be fun." Across the aisle sat Linda, decked out in a blazer that looked 2 sizes too expensive, surrounded by her board members and a team of young lawyers with glossy hair and smug smiles. She looked like a queen in exile, desperate to claw her way back to the throne. Her eyes darted toward Grandpa, burning with fury. She whispered something to her lead attorney, who rose dramatically, adjusting his tie as though he was about to argue a case for the Supreme Court. The gallery, packed with neighbors, reporters, and curious townsfolk, buzzed with whispers. Everyone knew this wasn't just a property dispute. This was a war for the soul of the community. The judge, a broad-shouldered woman with a reputation for no-nonsense rulings, slammed her gavel once and called the room to order. "Let's hear it," she said, her voice flat but sharp. Linda's lawyer sprang to his feet. He painted Grandpa as a menace, a selfish old man defying community rules, lowering property values, and threatening the stability of the neighborhood. He waved glossy photographs of Grandpa's cornfield like they were crime scene evidence. "Your Honor, this man is undermining everything our HOA stands for," the lawyer thundered, pacing the courtroom. Grandpa didn't flinch. He sat calm, hat in his lap, eyes half-lidded as though he was listening to a bedtime story. When the lawyer finished, Linda smirked, certain they'd won already. The judge scribbled a note and turned to Tommy. "Your response." Tommy stood slowly, adjusted his glasses, and picked up the satchel. He pulled out the first deed, holding it high for all to see. "Your Honor, what you've just heard is a fairy tale. A tale with villains, maybe even with clowns. But the truth is simpler. My client doesn't just live on this land, he owns it. Every acre, every foot, every blade of grass these people claim to manage. He handed the paper to the bailiff, who carried it to the judge. She studied it, eyebrows arching slightly. Then Tommy pulled out the next deed. And the next. One by one, he laid them on the bench until the judge's desk looked like it had been buried under an avalanche of paper. Here are the original bank transfers from 1958. Here are the tax receipts paid in full, every year without fail. Here are the surveys marking boundaries that include the clubhouse, the pool, the tennis courts, and yes, Ms. Linda's prized rose garden. He let that hang in the air. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Linda's face drained of color, her jaw clenching. The judge leaned back, steepling her fingers. So what you're telling me, Mr. Keegan, is that this entire subdivision technically sits on your client's land? Tommy's grin widened. Exactly. And this HOA, for all its bluster, has been exercising authority it never legally possessed. The room erupted. Gasps, whispers, even a few chuckles. A man in the back shouted, "I knew it!" The judge banged her gavel, restoring order. Linda's lawyer scrambled, fumbling through his notes. Objection. These documents are ancient, irrelevant. The judge cut him off. Sit down, counselor. They're as relevant as it gets. Linda rose from her seat, her voice trembling with rage. This can't be true. He's just an old man playing games with paper. We've been running this community for decades. The judge fixed her with a glare sharp enough to slice stone. Ms. Patterson, you've been trespassing for decades. Consider yourself lucky Mr. Callahan hasn't already filed for damages. Neighbors craned forward in their seats, jaws hanging open. 4 years, the HOA had ruled with an iron fist, fining kids for chalk drawings, banning backyard barbecues, even dictating what color curtains could hang in windows. And now, with one stack of deeds, Grandpa had knocked the entire empire to its knees. The judge slammed her gavel again. The court finds in favor of Mr. Callahan. Effective immediately, the HOA has no jurisdiction over his property. Furthermore, given the evidence, this court recognizes Mr. Callahan's ownership of the land upon which the HOA currently operates. If he so wishes, he may pursue eviction of the HOA from his property. The gallery exploded into noise, cheers, gasps, and laughter mingling in a chaotic chorus. Grandpa rose slowly, tipping his hat at the judge. Much obliged, Your Honor. Linda collapsed into her chair, her lawyers whispering frantically around her. She stared at Grandpa with hatred so deep it could cut steel. As Grandpa and his grandson walked out of the courthouse, the crowd followed, reporters shouting questions, neighbors clapping him on the back. The boy looked up at his grandfather, his voice trembling with awe. Grandpa, does this mean you can kick them out? Grandpa chuckled, lighting his pipe. Son, it means I can do a whole lot more than that. Across the street, Linda stood on the courthouse steps, her face twisted with rage. She shouted over the crowd, her voice cracking. This isn't over. You may have won here, but I'll take this higher. I'll ruin you if it's the last thing I do. The crowd hushed for a moment, eyes shifting to Grandpa. He puffed on his pipe, smoke curling in the air, and gave her a look that froze her in place. Calm, steady, unblinking. Then he turned away without a word, climbing into his truck. The boy leaned close as they drove home, whispering, "What happens now?" Grandpa grinned, eyes glinting. Now, boy, we decide what to do with an entire HOA squatting on my land. The day dawned strange, bright, warm, and yet heavy, like the air before a storm. Neighbors woke to the roar of diesel engines in the subdivision, and when they pulled back their curtains, they saw it. 2 yellow bulldozers parked in front of the clubhouse. Deputies stood nearby, arms crossed, keeping watch. At the center of it all stood Grandpa, cane in hand, hat tipped low, his grandson at his side. The satchel of deeds rested on the hood of his old Ford, papers neatly stacked and notarized. The crowd gathered fast. Some came with lawn chairs and thermoses of coffee, ready to see history unfold. Others came pale and trembling, clutching their HOA rulebooks like talismans. Linda arrived last, screeching into the cul-de-sac in her luxury SUV. She stormed out, red-faced and wild-eyed, screaming, "You can't do this! You'll destroy everything we built!" Grandpa looked at her for a long moment, then nodded to the deputies. They unfurled the court order for all to see. Grandpa had full right to reclaim and repurpose his land. With a low rumble, the bulldozers roared to life. Neighbors gasped as their blades pushed against the clubhouse walls, wood and plaster cracking like old bones. Linda shrieked, clawing at the air, but two deputies stepped in front of her. Dust rose high into the sky as the clubhouse crumbled. The symbol of the HOA's power, the place where fines were written, where rules were invented, where neighbors had been humiliated for years, collapsed into rubble. The cheer that erupted from the crowd shook the ground. Kids jumped and clapped, adults hugged each other, and even the deputies smiled. Grandpa didn't cheer. He just watched quietly, his pipe smoldering, eyes sharp. When the dust settled, he turned to the crowd. "This land belongs to the people who live on it. Not to a board. Not to a bully. Not to anyone who thinks they can charge you for planting flowers or raising tomatoes. Starting today, this ground will be used for something good." He gestured to the empty space where the clubhouse had stood. "We're building a community farmers market. Free stalls, free space. You want to grow cucumbers, sunflowers, or pumpkins? Do it. You want to sell homemade pies? Do it. This is for all of us." The neighbors erupted again, this time louder than before. Laughter, tears, shouts of joy. After years of living under the HOA's shadow, they could breathe again. The boy looked up at his grandfather, eyes shining. "You really did it, Grandpa. You beat them." Grandpa smiled faintly, patting his shoulder. "Son, this wasn't about beating them. It was about reminding folks they never needed them in the first place." But in the crowd, not everyone was smiling. Linda stood motionless, covered in dust, her rose-pink blazer streaked gray. Her eyes were locked on Grandpa, and for the first time, she wasn't shouting. She was calculating. Quiet rage burned in her gaze. That evening, after the celebration died down, Grandpa walked the property lines with his grandson. The night was calm, the stars spread wide, and the hound trotted at their heels. They stopped near Linda's house, its windows glowing dimly. The boy tugged at his grandfather's sleeve. "Grandpa, what happens to her? She's not going to stop, is she?" Grandpa looked at the house for a long while, then pulled a folded paper from his satchel. It was another deed, one he hadn't shown in court. He handed it to the boy, who squinted at the words. His mouth dropped open. "Grandpa, this says her house, it's on your land." Grandpa nodded slowly, a sly smile creeping across his face. "That's right. 4 years, she's been screaming about rules on ground she never owned. Now she's about to learn what rent feels like." The boy's eyes widened, half in shock, half in awe. "You mean, you're gonna make her pay you?" Grandpa tipped his hat, eyes gleaming under the moonlight. "Let's just say, the HOA's queen is about to find out who her landlord really is." And as the night deepened, the old man turned away from Linda's glowing windows, cane tapping steady on the dirt. Behind him, the rubble of the clubhouse lay quiet, but in front of him stretched a future he had shaped with his own hands. The war wasn't over, it had just shifted. The queen had lost her crown, but the game of pride and power had only begun.